"We will work. We will cook. We will serve. Just let us in," pleaded the Apache sisters. Before we begin the story, don't forget to like it and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The last ray of sunlight faded behind the mountains, leaving the valley in a gray twilight, with snow clinging to the shadows and the pine trees standing dark and motionless. Rowan Pike was alone in his cabin. The constant scraping of steel against stone filled the silence. He sharpened a knife with slow, confident movements, more out of habit than necessity. He lived in solitude in that corner of Colorado. A broad-shouldered 33-year-old, he had served as a scout on cavalry patrols and broken in horses on ranches. But he no longer had the patience for town disputes or blood feuds between men. His goal was simple: chop wood, keep the fire burning, and endure the winter. Rowan was not a grieving widower hiding from the world. He had chosen to be alone. After too many years of watching men destroy each other over pride or pieces of land, he realized that peace was worth more than money. He had no family waiting for him, nor did he seek one. He built his cabin, cleared the land, and kept his distance from soldiers and settlers. The knock on the door came suddenly. It was sharp and quick, followed immediately by another, as if they feared he would not open quickly enough. His hand paused on the knife, and his heart leapt in his chest. Rarely did anyone pass by there alone, lost or desperate. He left the blade on the table and looked at the rifle leaning against the wall. He did not take it yet, although the idea was on his mind. Another, louder knock. Rowan stood up and crossed the room, his boots echoing on the floorboards with each firm, measured step. He opened the door. The icy air rushed in, bringing with it the smell of snow and pine. 3 women stood on the threshold. They were Apaches, their faces marked by hunger, their clothes dirty and torn from the journey, their bare feet sinking into the snow. The eldest, perhaps 25 years old, stood in front. Her black hair fell loosely over her shoulders, with strips of leather still woven into some strands. Her suede dress was torn at the seams. The broken collar revealed more than Rowan would have liked to see, though he couldn't help himself. Bruises stained her arms, but she held her posture upright. She lifted her chin, though her lips trembled with cold. Behind her, the middle sister, about 22, looked tougher and more alert. Her eyes went straight to Rowan's rifle, calculating whether he could reach it. She had the look of someone accustomed to expecting the worst, ready to face it. The youngest, barely 18 or 19, clung to the 2, fragile and barefoot, her breath breaking into little white clouds. Her large eyes were full of fear, but also hope, begging for that door to give her a chance. The eldest spoke in a rough but firm voice. "We will obey. We will work. We will cook. We will serve. Just let us in." Rowan gripped the doorframe tightly. He felt the weight of those words more than the icy air against his skin. He had seen Apache families driven from their lands, hunted by soldiers and settlers, blamed for every attack, even though they were innocent. These 3 women bore the marks of all that in their eyes, not pushed to the limit, beaten, but refusing to die in silence. He thought quickly. If he let them in, they would need food, fire, and shelter. His supplies were already running low. Their presence could cause him problems if word got out in town. The settlers hated to see Apache faces, but if he turned them away, they would not survive the night. He knew that as clearly as the snow beneath his feet. Rowan clenched his jaw. His first impulse was to keep the door closed. He had built this life so as not to have to deal with other people's problems, and now those problems stood at his door, barefoot and scarred. The eldest did not beg again. She simply held his gaze, as if challenging him to decide.
Rowan felt a knot in his chest. He was not a man given to compassion. He had learned long ago that pity did not keep anyone alive. And this was not about pity. It was about whether he could watch 3 women freeze to death on his porch while he continued to sharpen a knife by the fire. The silence lingered. Then slowly, Rowan stepped back from the door. He nodded slightly, saying just enough. The eldest stepped forward, pushing her sisters along. They entered quickly. Their thin bodies brushed against him as they passed, bringing with them the smell of cold, leather, and smoke. The door closed behind them. The bolt clicked. Rowan returned to the stove. The women huddled close to the fire. Their eyes scanned the poor, rustic cabin, but it was warmer than the night outside. None of them said a word. Neither did Rowan. All that could be heard was the crackling of the embers and the wind gently pushing against the windows. For the first time in years, Rowan Pike was not alone. The cabin seemed smaller with 4 people inside. The air felt heavier, even though the fire struggled to bring warmth to every corner. Rowan sat back down at the table with the knife and stone still there, but he didn't touch them. He watched as the 3 women stood by the hearth. Their eyes scanned the cabin, as if trying to size up the place and make sure they would be safe there. The eldest kept her shoulders straight, but Rowan could see her fingers trembling as she held them close to the fire. She had been the one who spoke at the door, and her mere presence commanded respect. The middle sister had the hardest, sharpest gaze. Rowan thought that perhaps she had tried to take charge when the eldest hesitated, but in the end she submitted. The sister took a step forward. The youngest stayed closer to the fire, rubbing her arms with her hands, as if that could bring them back to life. Rowan then realized that they hadn't eaten in a long time. Their thin faces and empty breath confirmed it. He got up, went to his shelf, and took down a small bag of beans and a piece of salted bacon. He dropped them on the table with a thud and pointed to the pot hanging over the stove. "Food," he said simply. The middle sister reacted immediately, stepping forward without hesitation. She took the pot, filled it with water from a jug, and set to work. Her movements were quick and calculated, typical of someone accustomed to surviving on almost nothing. Rowan watched her stir the beans in silence, as the smell of pork began to fill the air. He took the opportunity to look at them more closely. Questions assailed him, the same ones any man would ask himself when he saw 3 Apache women alone on a winter road. Why were they there? Where did they come from? What happened to the men who were supposed to protect them? He didn't voice his doubts aloud, but he thought them, and he knew others would too if they saw them by his side. The eldest held his gaze once, then again, and after a long silence, said quietly, "We walked many days. Our people are gone." She didn't clarify whether they had been scattered in death or expelled. Her English was rough but clear enough. "With nowhere else to go, we came here." Rowan let those words hang in the air, asking for no further explanation. He knew enough about the wars between settlers and tribes to understand what their departure might mean. And he was not a man who liked to hear details that could not be changed. He looked at their feet, reddened and cracked from the cold. No boots, not even moccasins. That told him enough about what they had suffered. When the beans began to soften, the middle sister served 4 bowls. Rowan noticed that they divided their portion among the 3 of them, leaving the largest portion untouched, and pushed it toward him. He frowned, pushed it back, and said, "Yours." His tone was dry but forceful. The youngest looked at him in astonishment, as if she had never seen a man refuse food. She hesitated before taking a bite.
Then she bowed her head and took the bowl in both hands, slurping as if it were the most precious thing she had had in days. Rowan felt something stir inside him. It wasn't pity, but a firm pressure similar to the responsibility that falls on one whether one chooses it or not. Later, when the bowls were empty, Rowan took a folded blanket from the shelf and threw it on the floor near the hearth. The sisters spread it out and settled together on the boards near the heat. Rowan returned to the table, staring into the flames, his mind racing. He had let them in on instinct, perhaps out of decency, but now he wondered what would happen next. The valley was large and the winter cruel, and the provisions were not enough for even one man. Still, he had not bolted the door. That meant something, and he knew it. The night grew quiet. The sisters fell into a restless sleep. The youngest breathed heavily from time to time. Rowan stayed awake longer, listening to the crackling of the fire. His mind was caught between the silence he had chosen for years and the weight of 3 lives under his roof. For the first time in a long time, he felt uneasy, not because of fear, but because he understood that tomorrow would no longer be the same as yesterday. Morning came slowly. The first light filtered through the cracks in the gray, frosty shutters. That light that makes everything seem harsher than the night before. Rowan was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed he had built himself years ago. Boots on, shirt on. He listened to the steady breathing coming from the stove where the three women slept curled up under the blanket. For a moment he thought how strange it was to hear more than one breath inside his cabin. Strange, but not unpleasant. When he got up, the eldest was the first to move. She looked at him, blinked, and then slowly sat up, holding the blanket tightly over her shoulders. Her hair was tangled with strands across her face, but her eyes remained sharp and alert. Rowan noticed that she wasn't looking at him with fear, but with caution, as if waiting to see if he would change his mind about letting them stay. The middle sister got up next, without asking permission, went to the table, and began to gather what little was left for breakfast. Rowan was in the habit of eating stale bread or cecina in the mornings, but she filled the pot with water and threw in the last handful of dried corn, stirring it over the fire with quick, confident movements. She didn't waste words, but her actions spoke clearly. They were willing to bear their share of the burden. The youngest was the last to wake up, shivering as she sat up. Rowan noticed her bare feet again, the cracked spin on her heels. He realized he hadn't given them shoes, hadn't even asked. Any man in the village would have done so, whether out of mistrust or cruelty, but he had remained silent. Now he understood the unspoken question in the air. How long could they last there? With only rags to wear, he walked to a corner where he kept forgotten things, an old pair of wool socks and some small boots that a traveling merchant had left behind years ago. He placed them by the fire without saying a word. The youngest looked at him in surprise, and only after a moment did she dare to take them. The older one murmured something in Apache to her sisters, a soft thank you that needed no translation. She looked at him again, and this time there was something deeper in her face. Recognition, perhaps. Respect. As they ate, Rowan's thoughts swirled around. He wondered where they had come from, what had scattered them, why no men were with them. The older one seemed to pick up on his doubts. When they finished eating, she said slowly, "Soldiers came. Men from the settlements came too. Our house burned. We left. We walked many nights. Now we are here." Rowan did not ask for more details. He knew well what that meant. Raids, forced marches, killings. He had seen it before when he explored the border. The women who survived were left with nothing but what they could carry.
Their arrival was no coincidence. They were looking for someone who wouldn't turn them away. Later, Rowan put on his coat and went out with his axe over his shoulder. The cold was biting, but he needed wood for the stove. He chopped slowly, the echo rumbling in the still valley. When he returned with the first armful of wood, he stopped suddenly. The youngest was already coming in with small pieces in her arms. She looked strained, but with the stubborn expression of someone who does not intend to give up. The middle sister was at the table sewing a tear in her dress with fibers she had taken from her own clothes. The eldest was kneeling by the stove, washing the bowls carefully, as if keeping them clean had some special value. Rowan put down the firewood and stood watching. A thought struck him. These women had not come just to beg. They had come to stay the night. After another dinner of beans and salted meat stretched to the limit, Rowan sat down to carve a handle for a broken hammer. The light from the fire illuminated the cabin, casting shadows on the log walls. The sisters huddled together, speaking softly in their language, but from time to time the older one looked at him. He felt her eyes on him, gauging his silence, testing how much space he would allow them. Rowan thought about the questions that remained unanswered. They had living family who were looking for them. Would misfortune come to their door? He didn't ask them. He knew full well that the answers didn't always matter. What weighed on him was the decision he faced. He could send them away the next day and resume his solitary life, or he could accept that this would continue, along with the burden it entailed.
When he finally put down the knife, he noticed that the door was still unlocked from before. For years, he had locked it every night out of habit. That night, he hadn't. That was his answer, even if he didn't say it. The women slept near the fire again, huddled together for warmth. Rowan stayed awake longer, his thoughts heavy but firm. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty, and even though he hadn't put it into words, he knew he wouldn't miss them. The days after his arrival took on an unexpected routine, although it was a shared routine. Every morning the fire was already lit before he got up. The pot was full of water, and the youngest was carrying logs bigger than herself, as if she wanted to prove her worth without speaking. The middle sister worked at the stove with agility and precision, and Rowan soon realized that she could make a handful of beans or corn go farther than he ever had. The eldest took care of what was left, cleaning, mending, keeping the others on track. Rowan watched from the sidelines in silence. The weight of the decisions was still there, although he no longer thought about kicking them out. They never explained how far they had walked or what dangers they had faced before arriving. At first, Rowan suspected that men might come after them, soldiers, bounty hunters, or vengeful settlers. But as the days passed without a stranger appearing on the road, he realized that they had indeed come from far away. They brought no belongings, no blankets, no tools, only the torn clothes they wore. That was enough for him to tell that those who had expelled them had left them with nothing but their lives, and that was answer enough. Trust did not come quickly, but it came in gestures. He noticed it when the eldest left her sisters in the cabin and came out to accompany him while he worked on the fence. She didn't speak at first, just walked close enough for him to see that her bruises were beginning to fade. She retained the same upright pride, but now she watched him work with an air more curious than suspicious. Rowan lifted a post and drove it into the ground with firm blows of the hammer. The eldest stood a few steps away with her arms crossed against the cold. After a long silence, she said, "You leave the door open without locking it." Rowan stopped and lowered the hammer. "That's right," he replied.
She nodded slightly, as if she understood more than his words said. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment before she returned to the cabin. Rowan watched her walk away, feeling that thought weigh heavier than the hammer in his hand. She had noticed his decision. She knew he had left them inside, safe, without a bolt or a lock. That night, after dinner, the youngest fell asleep quickly, curled up by the fire. The middle sister remained silent, mending another seam. Rowan was carving a hammer handle again, the knife blade glinting under the lamp. The eldest sat closer to him, her hands folded in her lap. After a long silence, she reached out and touched the piece of wood he was working on. "You fix things," she said quietly. Rowan looked at her hand resting on the unfinished handle. His chest tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "Things break. Someone has to fix them." Her fingers remained on the wood for a moment, then brushed the back of his hand. It was no accident. Rowan felt his breathing change, and the silence in the cabin became heavier than it had been in years. He did not pull away. The middle sister noticed, but she lowered her eyes and continued sewing. Then Rowan understood that the bond that was forming between him and the eldest was not hidden. It was visible and somehow accepted. When the women went to bed, Rowan remained at the table. He set the knife aside, lost in his thoughts. The question that many would have asked, why had they come to him? Why did they trust him? It hung in the air. But the answer lay in his actions. They had nothing left, and he had been the man who did not reject them. That was enough to anchor them there. Before going to bed, Rowan walked to the door and rested his hand on the latch. He thought about the fear that had led them to knock on his door in the older woman's desperation. He thought about the way she had touched his hand without hesitation. Slowly, he dropped the latch again, leaving the door unsecured. For the second time in 2 nights, Rowan Pike made his decision without saying a word. The silence was no longer his alone.
The snow piled up in the valley, hardened by frost, crunched under his boots as he went out in the morning. The days followed the same routine. The fire lit at dawn, the beans or pineapple milk making the most of the water from the stream. But that rhythm no longer belonged to him alone. The sisters moved around the cabin in quiet order, each taking care of something without being asked. The youngest did light tasks, carrying firewood and sweeping the floor with dry sage branches, while the middle sister stood in front of the stove, cooking and tending the fire. The eldest watched everything, filling in where needed, and Rowan began to notice that she always chose the job closest to him. He hadn't asked their names. Anyone could guess who they were beyond the eldest, the middle one, and the youngest. One night, knife in hand, he thought about it himself. But as he looked at them, he realized that they hadn't asked his either. In that silence, there was an agreement. Names could come later when survival was assured. For now, what mattered was their presence. Still, questions lingered in Rowan's mind. They must have family alive somewhere. They were waiting for a relative to return. They were planning to leave when the snow melted. The eldest did not answer if he did not ask, and Rowan was not a man to insist. What he did notice was that they were already using his things as if they were their own. The youngest humming as she mended his old blanket, the middle one rearranging the jars on the shelf, the eldest standing next to his tools, touching them carefully as if wanting to get to know him through the weight of the iron and wood. One afternoon, after hours of chopping wood and repairing the corral, Rowan returned with tense shoulders and sore hands. The eldest was by the fire, finishing sewing with the tendon he had given her. When she got up and put her dress back on, the garment was now complete, fitting snugly without falling off her shoulders.
Rowan found himself staring at her. She noticed, and for a moment the corners of her mouth curved into a brief smile that quickly faded. He hurried to take care of his tools, although his mind remained hooked on that look. He wasn't sure if it was gratitude, pride, or something deeper. That night, when the sisters settled down by the fire, Rowan sat down again to carve. The eldest sister approached without hesitation and placed the mended dress on the table for him to see. "Fixed," she said in her slow but clear English. Rowan nodded. "You did well." Her hand lingered for a moment on the fabric. Then it brushed his as she withdrew it. The contact was brief, but it sent an unexpected current through him. He looked into her eyes. There was no longer fear in them, only determination. The middle sister, always attentive, looked up from the fire and glanced at them, but said nothing. She returned to her sewing. Rowan understood then that the younger sisters knew what was going on and did not object. Before going to sleep, Rowan checked the door as usual. Once again, he left the bolt unsecured. This time, he caught the eldest watching him. She gave him a slight nod, the same one she had given him outside when he had made his decision earlier. It was not a spoken agreement, but Rowan felt it as clearly as if she had said it in words. He was not only giving them shelter, he was giving them a place to belong. That night, as the fire died down, Rowan lay awake listening to her breathing. The questions that would trouble others, whether he had enough food, whether these women would bring danger, whether gossip would spread through the village, no longer weighed on him. What mattered was that the silence of the cabin no longer felt empty. The thaw had not yet arrived. The snow remained hard outside. The wind was so sharp it cut through any coat. But inside, the air was different. It was no longer just a refuge from the cold. Now it was a place where voices began to be heard at night, where dragging a chair no longer sounded hollow, where Rowan felt the weight of 3 women moving in his life, as if they had been there longer than they actually had. That afternoon, with the wind whipping against the shutters, Rowan sat at the table carving wood.
The older girl stood beside him, closer than usual. She placed the dress she had repaired earlier in front of him, smoothing it with her palms. The seams were firm, the fabric less torn, though still worn. She stood in the light of the fire, her figure outlined in the shadows. Rowan looked up once, then forced his gaze back to the wood in his hand, but the thought stayed with him. He wasn't blind, and she wasn't trying to hide. When the middle daughter and the youngest went to bed, the eldest remained awake by the fire. Rowan stayed at the table, unable to sleep, the cabin silent except for the crackling of the logs. After a while, she got up and walked toward him. She stood in front of the table with her fingers on the wood he was carving. "You're staying with us," she said in her broken English, not as a question, but as a statement. Rowan clenched his jaw and looked her straight in the eye. "I didn't kick them out." She nodded slowly, moved her hand, and brushed his knuckles. He felt the subtle but intentional warmth of her skin, and something inside him gave way. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the air thick with heavy silence. Then he moved closer, and she didn't back away. He raised his hand, hesitating for a second before placing his fingers on her arm. She tilted her head slightly, her lips parted, and Rowan leaned in. The first kiss was not rushed, it was cautious, almost uncertain, but charged with everything they had kept silent. When they parted, neither spoke. She touched his chest once firmly before returning to the stove. She lay down next to her sisters, leaving Rowan standing with his hands still burning from their touch. He sat back down, staring into the flames. The questions anyone would have asked. What did she want from him? How did he feel about her? Was it compassion or something more? He answered for himself. He knew it wasn't pity. It was the slow, heavy union of two people who had chosen not to turn away. That night, Rowan left the door unlocked once more, and for the first time, he didn't wonder if it was the right decision. The next morning, after their first kiss, they said nothing to each other. Rowan got up early, put on his boots, and went out into the crisp air. He chopped wood more slowly than usual, his mind spinning with what had happened between them. He hadn't expected it, but he hadn't stopped it either. He still felt the weight of his lips, the pressure of her hand on his chest, making him feel uneasy and yet steadfast at the same time. When he returned inside, the older woman was standing by the stove, as if the previous night had never happened. She stirred the pot calmly, her face serene, her hands steady. She didn't look at him at first, but as she handed him a bowl, her fingers brushed his again with intention, and she held his gaze long enough to tell him she hadn't forgotten. The middle sister noticed it too. Her gaze was sharp, sustained, as if measuring whether what she saw was trust or danger. She said nothing, but Rowan could feel her attention. The youngest, oblivious or unwilling to worry, hummed softly as she folded the blanket, her light smile making the cabin seem less harsh. That day, Rowan worked in the corral with the eldest. He passed her tools and showed her how to secure a post, how to tie it firmly so it would hold. She listened carefully, tried it with her own hands, and when she succeeded, she looked at him expectantly. Rowan responded with a slight nod. She smiled faintly. A different smile, small but lively, struck him harder than he wanted to admit. In the afternoon, the middle child joined them, carrying water and watching as they worked together. Her silence brought judgment. Rowan understood her distrust. She wanted proof that his interest in her sister was not the same desire they had fled from. He didn't blame her. He moved his hands carefully, his touch measured, making it clear that there was no brute force in him, only perseverance.
That night, after dinner, the cabin fell silent again. The youngest fell asleep first, curled up by the fire. The middle one sewed patches onto her skirt, her eyes still rising from time to Rowan and the eldest. She sat closer than ever, almost touching his shoulder. The light from the fire outlined the profile of her face, the silhouette of her body under the patched dress. Rowan kept his eyes fixed on the flames, but her presence enveloped him like a weight. After a long silence, she leaned in slightly and spoke softly. "Alone for a long time?" Rowan nodded once. "Yes, not alone now." Her words were simple, but her tone said more.
She was telling him that she had decided to stay, that what was beginning between them was not chance but choice. Rowan rested his hand on her knee. She placed hers on top, light but firm. He didn't pull away. The middle sister's sewing paused for a moment. Rowan noticed her watching them, but soon she returned to her work. It wasn't full approval, but she had chosen not to interfere, and that was a form of acceptance. Later, when the others had gone to bed, Rowan remained at the table. The eldest sister also stood under the glow of the dying fire. She looked at him for a long time before approaching, raising her hand and touching his face, rough from the day's beard. Rowan gently held her wrist, keeping her there. Her breathing deepened, and this time when she leaned in, the kiss was not hesitant. It was longer, firmer, charged with all the restraint of before. When they parted, she rested her forehead on his chest for a moment before pulling away. She returned to her sisters, lying down next to them. Rowan stood with his heart steady, but filled with something new. The questions anyone would have asked. Did the sisters accept this bond? Was their silence proof of truth or evasion? She really wanted to stay. They had their answer in small gestures. The watchful gaze of the middle sister had softened. The youngest showed no fear, and the eldest had chosen him with her hands, her eyes, her kiss. Rowan finally lay down, the fire reduced to embers. He left the door unlocked again, not out of habit, but because the cabin was no longer his alone. The thaw had not yet arrived, but the snow was softening on the banks of the stream. Small strips of dark earth were visible where the current pressed against the banks. Rowan noticed it that morning as he leaned on his axe and watched the water flow more strongly than it had in weeks. He knew what it meant. The harshness of winter was turning, and soon the valley would change. They would know it too, and he wondered if they would choose to leave when the past caught up with them again into sips. That doubt stayed with him, even as he brought the axe down on the log again. The blow echoed in the still air inside. The sisters had already found their place more firmly. The youngest no longer clung so tightly to the others. She carried firewood and water without being asked. She hummed as she worked, her feet now covered by the boots Rowan had given her. The middle sister had turned her small reserves of flour and corn into meals that went much further than Rowan had ever imagined. He found himself eating better than in all the years he had spent in Soledad. The eldest moved among them all, observing, guiding, and most of the time staying close to Rowan. Her presence was felt even without speaking. That night after dinner, Rowan sat down to carve wood at the table. The eldest remained beside him, their shoulders almost touching. From time to time, she would rest her hand on the table so close to his that he could feel the warmth of her skin. The middle sister sewed quietly by the fire. The youngest was already asleep with her head resting on a folded blanket. The lamp burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. Rowan finished the piece of wood and set it aside. The eldest sister took it, turned it carefully, and once again her fingers brushed his. She looked at him intently, and Rowan felt the air change.
She got up silently and walked toward her bed, not toward the stove. She stood there waiting with her hand on the edge of the blanket. She wasn't demanding, but she wasn't hesitating either. She had made her decision. Rowan got up slowly, his chest tight. He looked at the middle sister. She returned his gaze with a serious expression, but no objection. She lowered her eyes back to her sewing, though her hands were no longer moving. Rowan understood. This was between him and the eldest sister. He crossed the room, each step measured. The eldest sister greeted him with her chin up, her hair loose, her silhouette outlined by the light from the lamp. Rowan stopped nearby, raised his hand and touched first her arm, then her face. She leaned into the contact, closing her eyes for a moment before looking at him again. When their lips met, it was different, less hesitant, more confident. She held his shirt tightly, pulling him closer, his arm wrapped around her waist, feeling the curve of her body through the thin fabric.
The kiss deepened, charged with the silence of all the nights they had waited. When they parted, she rested her forehead on his chest. He held her for a moment before guiding her to the bed. The fire crackled in the almost extinguished lamp. The middle sister's eyes still shone in the shadows, but her silence was firm. Rowan and the eldest lay down together, slowly, gently. Each caress was measured, thoughtful, earned after weeks of restraint. In the end, with her head on his shoulder, Rowan fought a calm he hadn't known in years. The doubts anyone would have had about whether his sisters would accept him, whether Rowan's silence hid selfishness, whether she had truly chosen him, they found their answer that night. The sisters had seen and remained silent. The eldest had made her decision clear, and Rowan had taken her in his arms, not eagerly, but with the certainty of a man willing to keep her there. When dawn filtered through the cracks, Rowan woke up with her by his side, her hand on his chest, breathing quietly. He looked toward the fire and saw the middle sister also asleep, her unfinished sewing in her lap. The youngest stirred under the blanket, but only turned over. The cabin was filled with a silence Rowan had never felt before. It wasn't emptiness, it was a full silence. Rowan got up carefully, put on his boots, and stepped out into the pale morning air. The sky had not yet arrived, but for the first time in years, she was not thinking about surviving alone. She was thinking about what it meant to have people who would stay when the snow came. By the time the sky had fully arrived, the valley looked different. The stream had swollen with melted snow, the ground had turned to mud next to the fences, and the birds were returning to the pine trees. Inside the cabin, life had also changed. Where before there had only been silence broken by the crackling of the fire, now there was quiet work, murmurs of voices and sometimes the soft laughter of the youngest when Rowan said something in his dry, clumsy way that amused her more than he intended. Rowan spent his mornings repairing tools, fixing fence posts, and tending to the corral. The eldest worked with him. Her hands no longer trembled when she picked up a hammer or held a rope. She had become stronger, more steadfast, and Rowan saw it every day. He hadn't asked for a partner, but now he had one, and she was by his side, without him having to order her to be. The middle daughter kept the cabin tidy, transforming scraps of fabric into new clothes, boiling broths that yielded more than Rowan thought possible. The youngest used to carry water without being asked, humming as she worked, her face more colorful than when she first arrived. Rowan used to watch silently from a corner. He found himself thinking about how natural it all looked, how quickly the cabin had gone from being his refuge to becoming a home. He thought that others might wonder what would happen in the spring. They would leave. Others would come looking for them. The answer was already there. The women had begun to call the cabin home in their own language, a word Rowan did not know, but understood when he heard it. They weren't waiting for another place. They had chosen this one. One night, as the fire burned down, the eldest sat down next to Rowan, resting her hand on his knee as if it had always been there. She had never talked much about her feelings, not in words, but her actions left no doubt. That night, she finally said it. "We stay," she said it simply, her voice firm. "With you," Rowan nodded. He wasn't a man of many words, but his silence carried weight. He covered her hand with his and left it there as his answer. The middle sister, who had watched him with suspicion for so long, looked up from her sewing. She looked at him for a moment, then nodded slightly. She had seen enough to know that he had not harmed her older sister. He hadn't forced her, he hadn't failed them. The youngest brought her palms together, smiling softly, as if she understood too. Rowan then got up and went to the corner where he had been working in secret for days. He lifted a cradle board carved from Enro wood, polished smooth with leather straps ready. He placed it against the wall next to the hearth. The sisters looked at him, their expressions shifting from surprise to something warmer. Rowan didn't explain, but they understood that it wasn't just about surviving the winter, it was about a future.
That night, Rowan and the eldest lay down together again, not with doubt, but with certainty. In her eyes, he no longer saw only resistance. He saw determination. He saw belonging. By spring, the cabin was full of life. The door was left unlocked, not out of carelessness, but because there was no longer any fear of what was outside. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney. Voices rang out in the courtyard, and that lonely man spent his days in company. The questions that had once lingered were now gone. The women were not passing through. They were staying. Rowan had not taken the men out of pity. He had accepted them as family. The bond between him and the eldest was neither an accident nor a moment of hunger. It had been born of weeks of silence, trust, and shared work. Even the watchful eyes of the middle sister had softened. The youngest no longer showed fear. On a clear morning, Rowan went outside with the eldest at his side. The fresh air smelled of wet earth and pine. She slipped her hand into his, and he didn't let go. Behind them, the sisters worked in the cabin, their laughter escaping through the open window. Rowan Pike had built that cabin to live alone, but now, without planning it, he had built a home. And in that home, for the first time in years, he was no longer a man waiting for the cold. He was a man with a family, and he knew they would not leave.